Here we go. Great. Thank you. All right. As many thanks to Monty. As he said, this is my first sermon up here with the church, so I appreciate everyone's patience. Okay, we're going to talk about a subject today, something that we do all the time. In the church, we talk a lot about the Sabbath rest and how we are to cease from all our labors. But funny enough, very rarely do we talk about our labors. So, typical of me, forgive me, we're going to talk today about work. So, in fact, there's a lot of kind of neat little words in here that deal with this subject. And work to me is very important because if nothing else, this is how everything we see and feel has been called into existence. One of God's very first act was the creation, which was work, in its very real and truest sense. And this is a song here, if anyone's into contemporary Christian music, group here by Jars of Clay, and they did a song about work, although it really doesn't deal with work. So, just thought. Okay, some quotes. I like work. It fascinates me. I can sit and look at it for hours. I always arrive late at the office, but I make up for it by leaving early. I love deadlines. I love the whooshing sound they make as they go by me. And I think a lot of us can relate to that last one there. So obviously in modern culture, we make fun of work. It's like, if there can be criticism, you're working too hard. It's like you need to take a rest. You need to take it easy. And I am not saying that we are to be slaves to our masters working 80 hours a week. But at the same time, I think there's a different perspective we need to have. So what is work? Some truly secular definitions. First one, that kind of slipped in there. That's from a physics book. Next one is to perform work or fulfill duties regularly for a wages or salary, a job. And that's what most of us in here do. We have a job. Next one, though, is to exert oneself physically or mentally, especially in a sustained effort for a purpose or under compulsion or necessity. Again, this is kind of like a grinding drudgery almost. But there's other perspectives. What is work from the Bible? It is the original act of God. The creation was work. And in fact, God did it for 6 days. And then on the seventh, he finally rested. After God created man, probably the first thing he told man to do was to cultivate in the Garden of Eden. That took work. The act of salvation is work. Jesus died on the cross. And I don't know all the theological significance. Maybe Monty could help me sometime. But he descended into Hades for 3 days and then came up. I don't understand all that. But he worked. The act of sanctification, that he who began a good work in you will perfect it until the day of Christ Jesus. He began a work in us. How we support our families. Us men, we go to work every day and do whatever it is that our wives think we do. It's probably a mystery. Actually, we just play cards all the time, Emily, just in case you're wondering. But seriously, and for most of man's history, the men, and also the women too, labored away in the farm fields. For most of history, people were farmers, and the farmers worked hard. And they had to trust God because sometimes the rains did not come. And so this year, it is also how we are enabled to help others. And we'll talk about that in a minute, some passages of what Jesus said we should do with the proceeds from our work. And also how we appear to outsiders. Maybe not outside how we appear, but our witness to the non-Christians around us. All right. Work is, the whole definition is laden with a lot of theological significance. God's work, I'm not sure how you say that's French. I'm not very good at French. My wife, can you help me with that?
Raison d'être.
Raison d'être, whatever. All right, but it is the reason or justification for being or existence. God's creation is kind of like almost why he is who he is and why he is here. You know, and you read the first 5 verses of the book of John. In the beginning was the Word. So all of that is, you know, a much different view. Work was something very good. And of course, the quote from Genesis on how God had worked 6 days and then rested on the 7th. And this is kind of interesting because for contemporary people, the concept of work has been divorced from religion. It has largely been shaped by the secular ideologies associated with Marxism and capitalism. So for once in my life, I'm going to group Marxism and capitalism in the same group because they are materialistic viewpoints of work. And what we think of work these days is just a materialistic viewpoint. And what I'm trying to do today is say there is a real spiritual dimension to it. And that there's more to work than just grubbing every day at the job so I can throw some food at the plate at night. There was one quotation is that human beings have the responsibility and privilege of virtually replicating the works of God. The human race co-creates and co-rules with God as it replenishes the earth and exercises dominion over the universe. And you can find that a lot as you read through Genesis. And this is kind of unique, and I'll go through that in a minute. Some more verses. Then the Lord God took man and put him into the Garden of Eden to cultivate and keep it. And when you look at Israel and you look at its neighbors, again, I'm going to digress a little bit here. If you read a lot of like historians of antiquity and people who say where the Christian, the Jewish religions came from, they say, oh, they were just influenced by all the people around them. The Zoroastrians and people like that. And I take umbrage at that and say that no, that's not the case. Back in all the other surrounding pagan cultures, divine work was not something to be admired, as creation emerged either as a struggle between the gods, as in Mesopotamia, or even as an act in defilement. Work was regarded as a dreary burden. In fact, the gods, small g, made the human race as slaves to provide relief from the labor of running the universe. Although human beings are sometimes regarded as the divine image in some Egyptian text, they are essentially the cattle of the gods, small g. Now, you can kind of understand where that comes from. You know, work is hard. And when you read after Adam and Eve fell from grace, when they took of the apple, you know, what did God say to man? You shall toil every day, and the ground shall yield thistles. Work became hard after the fall. And that is also a promise, though, that when we finally do go to God in glory, work will be different. All right, so let's go on to the New Testament here. Paul's example, 1 Corinthians 4:12. And we toil, working with our own hands. When we revile, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure. It's kind of a verse, though, that talks about endurance and Paul's tenacity in the face of persecution. He did not give up. Paul, the Apostle Paul, who is remembered 2,000 years later as being probably one of the key persons of the new church, he worked and he had to work hard. Acts 18:3, and because he was of the same trade, again referring to Paul, he stayed with them, and they were working, for by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. He was a tent maker. In fact, I think there's a Christian ministry group called Tent Makers, and their objective is to go into closed countries that do not normally accept Christian missionaries. And by working in secular occupations, they have the opportunity, and I dare say the credibility, to be a witness to the non-Christians around them. So work can give you an in that nothing else can do. I know my secular co-workers probably think more of hearing the message of the gospel from me than just some street preacher. And not that I am any better than Peter, but you know I was going to name names. But at the same time, you know the person. You know his in and outs. I mean, you know, people at my work, they see me every day when I'm in a good mood or in a bad mood. And so I have to be careful with what I say and what I do, that I do present a good witness. There goes my reading glasses. So anyhow, and I have an interesting quote here. What is possible, what can be accomplished when a generation stops assuming that someone else will take care of them and taking care of the brokenness of the world, or that someone else will capitalize on current opportunities and realize that they themselves are called into action? When we were children, we spoke as a child, we acted as a child, and someone was always there to take care of us. And as I tell my sons now that they're 24, is that you now have to leave that behind. God has called you to a new phase of life. You are the person who is called to take action. Someone to stand in the gap for the land so that it would not be destroyed, as Isaiah once said. Charity, Acts 20. You yourselves know that these hands ministered to my own needs and the men who were with me. So again, Paul took care of himself and the fellow preachers who were with him. And everything I showed you, that by working hard in this manner, you must help the weak and remember the words of the Lord Jesus, that he himself said that it is better to give than to receive. How am I going to give to the poor unless I have something to give them? Galatians 6, 9 through 10. Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due time we shall reap if we do not grow weary. So then, while we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who are the household of faith. Now, that doesn't actually talk directly about work, but still, I think you get the same idea. James 2:16. This is always a good one. If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of them says to them, "Go in peace, be warm and filled," and yet you do not give them what is necessary for the body, what use is that? You know, I remember in Houston one time, I was driving down the road and I saw an advertisement for one of the local liberal arts schools. And it says, you know, be something, raise awareness, something to that nature. And I thought, raise awareness. And really, that's what this life is all about these days. You know, our job is to go into YouTube and watch people raising our awareness on the gazillion issues that are out there. I mean, it is heart-rending. I mean, I have told my wife, I had actually stopped listening to these people because it just gets me worked up. And that's the problem. I think to be noble these days, in today's society, all you have to do is raise awareness. Be warm and filled. And Jesus says, no, do something. If you ever read, there's a book I'm going to be referencing called, by a German philosopher named Max Weber called I can't even say it right, Protestantism and the Spirit of Capitalism. But one of the things he introduces is a lot of German terms which I will not torment you with. But the whole idea is that based on your inner convictions, your inner workings, you work out and how I can do something physically in my society. So don't just say, I need to help the poor. Do something. Now, it may be help supporting someone else who does a charity. And in a way, I have to say one thing that's good in a society, they do have groups. And I know at my workplace, we have the United Way campaign every year. And, you know, politics aside, I have the opportunity to, you know, say, okay, I will give so much money to this organization or that organization, because we have done a very good job in isolating ourselves sometimes from those who are truly needy. And I know in this group we have needs. I know that. But there are also needs elsewhere that we don't deal with. And so it's a reminder that there are others far less fortunate than I. And Timothy, for if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And this is a strong statement. And this is hard. Providing for one's family is hard. Life has not always been good. I know I myself can attest to I've been laid off. And if there's a way to punch a man hard in the stomach, that is the way to go. I've heard someone say that to a man losing his job is the same thing to a woman who finds out that her husband has been committing adultery. It has that same emotional impact. And I know for women who lose a job, it is very hard as well. I'm not trying to dismiss that at all. But just the emotional impacts, we truly associate a lot of our lives. My pastor at our church back in Houston once said, we complain about Monday getting up to go to work every morning. Well, the only thing worse than that is getting up Monday and not having any place to go to. Our witness, 1 Thessalonians 3:8. Nor did we eat anyone's bread without paying for it, but with labor and hardship we kept working day and night so that we would not be a burden to any of you. And, it's interesting. Sometimes when we do good as Christians, we think, I have a special dispensation. I should get things for free. Growing up, I knew Christians who had a little bit of that attitude. I'm not saying that's right. I don't think it is. But Paul said, we did not eat anyone else's bread without paying for it. 1 Thessalonians 4. And make it your ambition to lead a quiet life and attend to your own business and to work with your hands, just as we command you, so that you will behave properly towards outsiders and not be in any need. Again, you have to think about it. Probably the most maligned individual in all of history has been none other than the lowly farmer. Most of us have been farmers. And you have some clever soul who says, I have all these people farming. Surely they can afford to give me a little bit of their bread so I can go and rule over them. And that's actually how many societies are structured. There's a book I read called Why Nations Are Poor, or Why Nations Fail. And most economies in this world, up until recent history, have been what we call extractive economies. You have one person at the top, you have many workers, and the job of those many workers is to give their produce or whatever to the one person at the top so he can live well in his castle overlooking the farm fields. The other thing I want to bring attention to is that it is important that we do work hard and work effectively in our workplace, because this does, I think, give a good witness to the people around us. I've known Christians who view their job as merely a springboard for their other ministry, which did not involve their co-workers. And I know other Christians who took their job seriously, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So again, why work? Because we need to eat and we desire shelter. This church that we enjoy right now, even as we speak, was done by someone who was willing to work. We may need to provide those who need our support, our family and our children. It gives us meaning. For good or bad, it does. We associate our lives with what we do. It gives us inspiration. If you look at the history of great men and women who have done great things, you talk to them, it didn't come about because they were just sitting in the easy chair just gazing off in distance. They were doing something. The greatest ideas came from people who were busy. And ultimately, working may actually be a means by which we please God. Interesting verse over here. The rich young ruler. There are many levels that you can go over this verse. A ruler questioned him, saying, "Good teacher, what shall I do to inherit good life?" Now, he's calling Jesus good teacher. Now, Jesus is more than that, and he may have known that. And a teacher is nice because a teacher just tells you things. And you evaluate it, maybe, maybe not. But the God of the universe sees our heart. And if he tells you something and you don't do it, that's a totally another issue. Jesus said to him, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." There's a little bit of sarcasm there, I think. Or instruction. "You know the commandments. Do not commit adultery. Do not murder. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness, and honor your father and mother. And the young man said, all these things I have kept from my youth. When Jesus heard this, he said to him, one thing you still lack. Sell all that you possess and distribute it to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven. So what's the difference between this and Paul's exhortation to work? And I think a few things. I talked a little bit about the extractive economy. How does a young man become rich in a society where 99% of the people are poor? He probably inherited his wealth, and he inherited his position which enabled him to extract from those around him a percentage of their work and their efforts. And Jesus probably knew that. He says, why don't you start giving it back, what you have taken? It is one thing to accumulate wealth because you have worked hard for it in a just and fair manner. It's another thing when you have taken it from others. I know some of the, there is a subculture in Christianity of the wealth and prosperity people, and their mantra is, you don't have to work hard. You need to reap from other people's labors. Because really, if you're going to become, I'm not saying wealthy, like filthy rich or anything like that, or to lord it over people, but if you were to have means, you either do it by working yourself or taking it from others. And I think taking it from others is a special condemnation. Interesting over here from 1 Corinthians. This is where Paul writes, each man must remain in that condition in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Do not worry about it. But if you're able to become free, rather do that. For he who was called of the Lord while a slave is the Lord's free man. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You are bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men, or sin for that matter. Slavery was a common state for many people in Paul's time. 30 to 40% of the people in Rome were slaves. And in fact, some of the slaves actually held not important positions. They were sometimes doctors and engineers working for the Roman Empire. But the point was, and there was an attitude, I think, back at that time in the early church that Christ was coming soon. So no need to get overly worried about your condition. But still, Paul says, if possible, be free. All right, now we're going to get into a little bit of interesting stuff here. We're almost done. These are two quotes from Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin his father was a strict Calvinist, and he used to drill into him every day when he was a young man. Seest thou a man active in his calling, he shall stand before kings. And I think that's from Proverbs or somewhere. And you think about it. A man who does his job well, with a spirit of excellence, he does good things. And you think, okay, that's fine, John, but that's kind of drudgery, more of the same. Well, let's think about two prominent individuals in the Bible, Joseph and Daniel. Both of those worked in a very secular occupation. They worked for rulers who were not Christians, who in fact persecuted believers. Okay, Joseph and Daniel were not really Christians, but they were believers. All right, just for the technical accuracy here. But because they did their jobs well, they were made essentially co-rulers with a secular leader. And because they were co-rulers, because they held high positions of authority, they were able to save their people. And I know this day, I know in one country, because a senior member of the administration is a strong Christian, he is now leading a Bible study with the cabinet group. And I know in my company, a senior vice president is a strong Christian, and because of that, there is actually a quote-unquote unofficial Christian community it's not endorsed, but encouraged to participate within the company's campus. And that's encouraging to me as a Christian, that I can worship freely. I do not take that for granted. If it weren't for Christians in high places, we would probably be under more persecution. And maybe persecution would be good for purification of the church. I get that, but persecution is not fun. All right. A few items in here. A second. Yeah, okay. Okay, slides were out of order here, but that's all right. The Reformation profoundly affected the view of work, dignifying even the most mundane professions as adding to the common good, and thus blessed by God as much as any sacred calling would be. And this came from Martin Luther. And Martin Luther, of course, originally was a monk in the Catholic Church. He was an ascetic, spent his days contemplating. But he saw how the butcher, the farmer, and the carpenter made things that people needed. And one of the concepts that came out of it is that, no, the priest is not here and you are here. You are equal to the priest. And in fact, not only is your standing to society the same, but that your profession as a farmer is just as spiritually worthy as that of being a priest or a minister or a monk. After all, the original occupation for man was that of a gardener. And I know of someone who was a carpenter. Jesus was not born as a Levi and ministered in the temple and then all of a sudden became the prophet. No, he was a lowly carpenter. All right. Max Weber, interesting enough, one of his even though he was German, he criticized Lutheranism because it kind of encouraged staying in the status quo. And there's a lot of history I'd rather not go into right now for the sake of time. But he was impressed by the Calvinists and the Peists who diligently worked hard and continued working to build up something for their family. A lot of people have this typical 9-to-5 job attitude. I work just enough to make what I need. I used to work at a factory, and I would see the hourly workers. Once they had enough money for the month, they would stop coming to work because they had enough for their need. They would just hang around and watch TV. Yeah, life is good. Whereas other people kept on working. Now, why were they working? Was it because work was an end to itself? No. But somehow they knew, I need to prepare for the future. Maybe I'd like to send my kids to college. Maybe I'd like to have a nicer house. Maybe I need to help someone who needs help. Maybe I need to do something worthy in my time. What is more worthy, sitting in front of the TV or working at your job? Or watching YouTube videos? Anyhow. One of the words that I mentioned here was beruf. Beruf, if you, let's say you were in Germany and you were filling out some application or something like that, beruf nowadays in the secular sense means profession, right? But it was a term actually coined by Luther. And it means more than profession, it means a calling. The English equivalent is calling. God has called you to do something. And that calling can be something as simple as teaching English or something else. It's, any job that is morally good is adequate for a calling. A few side notes over here. One interesting thing as a result of the Protestant Reformation. The Catholic Church assured salvation to individuals who accepted the church sacraments and submitted to clerical authority. It may not be wholly in line with Scripture, but it's something that if I did this, if I did that, and I did that, I would be saved. Now, salvation by works, we know, is not the way to go, but you can kind of understand the appeal to it. And sometimes it's like, in lack of anything else, how do I know? The Reformation removed such assurances. It says, read the Scripture. It does not say that's how you become saved. In the absence of such signs of assurance from religious authorities, Protestants looked for other signs that they were saved. I won't go into the Calvin doctrine of double predestination, but essentially it says, if you're saved, you're good. If not, or a question, if you are called by God to be saved, you're good. If you're not called by God, there's nothing you can do. You will spend your time in hell. Right? The inability to influence one's own salvation presented a difficult problem for Calvin's followers. and it became an absolute duty to believe that one was chosen for salvation. Lack of self-confidence was evidence of insufficient faith, kind of like a little bit of circular reasoning there, and a sign of damnation. So self-confidence in one's salvation took the place of priestly assurance. Now, I know nowhere that says that if you confess with your lips and believe in your heart that Jesus is Lord, that you'll be saved. All right. And that's, we have, I think, a little bit better view of it nowadays. Again, I'm just giving you a historical perspective. So what was one sure way of showing that one was chosen to be the elect? And that was being successful in your work. If you were a hard worker, well respected by your peers, and you had a nice house in the corner of Geneva, Switzerland, you were the man. Or the woman, for that matter. And it's interesting because Weber criticized the German Lutheran office and its aura of office because they were still a little bit more hung up with the old idea of like, we'll tell you where you stand. He says, no, this is up to you. Okay. Testing. Great faith is the product of great fights. Great testimonies are the outcome of great tests. Great triumphs can only come out of great trials. In this Christian life, we are not called to a life of ease or peace of comfort. And obviously, God will grant that to us from time to time. But also from time to time, God does put us through hardship. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Problem of Pain. I highly recommend it. Unlike his other books, it reads as a solid Christian devotional. And he doesn't pull punches. God sometimes puts us through painful situations. And I know someone very close to Julie and I right now that's going through such a situation. Bewährung, I think I said that right, is a test or trial to which believers are subjected, and which, if they come through unscathed, show them to be in a state of grace. What did Jesus say to Peter? You will be sifted like wheat. Peter certainly was subjected to trials of the most firm kind. Okay. All right, so in summary, what we talked about, work is the original act of God. It is man's command to work in the garden, if nothing else. And just as a side note, both C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien were both believers in leading a quiet life and working with their hands. Anyone remember the movie, The Fellowship of the Ring? Okay. Now, it shows Hobbit Town, all these cute little hobbits. But what did they do? They were farmers. They were craftsmen. They made everything that they owned. And everyone seemed to be working. There wasn't, even though there was a leader of the community, it wasn't like he just rested in comfort. Everyone worked and enjoyed a quiet life. Hobbits never did anything outrageous. They never went on adventures. They were content to live and enjoy life as it should be. The quote from Madeleine de Langle, in a very real sense, not one of us is qualified, but it seems that God continually chooses the most unqualified to do his work, to bear his glory. If we are qualified, we tend to think that we have done the jobs ourselves. If we are forced to accept our evident lack of qualification, then there's no danger that we will confuse God's work with our own, or God's glory with ours. Two quotes here. Leo Tolstoy pretty much saying the same thing, to a quiet, secluded life in the country with the possibility of being useful to people to whom it is easy to do good and who are not accustomed to having done to them. Such is my idea of happiness. And Edison wrote, we often miss opportunity because it is dressed in overalls and looks like work. Okay, it is not man's punishment. It is his reward and his strength and his pleasure. And for further reading, Max Weber's Protestantism in the Spirit of Capitalism, The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, a more recent book, but he draws a lot upon Weber's work and says culture plays a big role in why some nations prosper and others don't. And he points out to some strong examples in Japan and Korea. And then Tribe by Sebastian Junger. We need to belong to something. Probably the greatest failures of modern society is that it does a great job of making us feel irrelevant. So, thank you very much.